In the early hours of February 23, 1991, inside a quiet beachside condominium in Rocky Point, Mexico, a family vacation turned into a nightmare. What had started as a short getaway was winding down. The night was calm. The surrounding units were quiet. Most people were asleep, unaware that behind one closed door, something had gone terribly wrong. Inside that room, a woman was found lying on the floor beside the bed she had shared with her husband only hours earlier. Her body was still. The sheets were disturbed, and it was immediately clear that this was not a medical emergency or an accident. She had been stabbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass, nothing to suggest a stranger had slipped in from the outside under the cover of darkness. The room looked exactly as it should have looked after a normal night on vacation, except for the woman on the floor. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the fact that this was a family trip. Her children were nearby. This was supposed to be a safe place, a temporary escape from everyday life. A few days of sun, rest, and togetherness. And the man closest to her when help was called was the man who had planned the entire trip, her husband, the person she trusted most, the person who had crossed the border with her, slept beside her that night, and was now standing at the center of a scene that made no sense. By the time the sun began to rise over the coastline, Mexican authorities were already asking questions, but what they did not yet realize was that the answers were not hidden somewhere outside that room. They were buried in secrets that had been forming long before the family ever packed their bags. Welcome back to True Crime X. This is where we talk about true life stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Stories about real people, hidden lives, and moments when everything changes in a single night. This is not just a story about a woman found dead on vacation. It is a story about betrayal, deception, and a truth that followed a family all the way home. Before anyone ever looked at Mexico as a crime scene, Trish and Dan Willoughby looked like a family that fit neatly into the background of everyday life. They were married, they had children, they shared routines, responsibilities, and the outward rhythm of a normal American household. From the outside, there was nothing alarming about them planning a family vacation. No public fights, no obvious chaos, just a couple doing what many families do when they want time away together. But what people saw was only the surface. Inside the marriage, things were far more complicated. Trish was carrying more than people realized. She was deeply invested in a business she ran with her mother, one that brought in serious money and came with serious pressure. She was juggling family, finances, and a marriage that no longer felt secure. People close to her later said she was trying to save it, still believing effort could fix what felt broken. Dan, meanwhile, was no longer living fully inside that marriage. He was involved with another woman, not a rumor, not a passing mistake. A relationship that existed quietly alongside his life as a husband and father. And as that secret grew, so did the distance between the life Trish thought she was living and the one Dan was actually leading. Around this same time, uncomfortable conversations started happening. Discussions about money, about insurance, about what would happen if something went wrong. On their own, those talks might not have meant much, but taken together, they added a weight that would later be impossible to ignore. When Dan suggested the trip to Mexico, it was framed as a gift, a reset, a chance to breathe. Not long before the trip, Trish told her mother she did not want to go. She could not explain it clearly, only that she felt uneasy about the journey, as if something about it made her uncomfortable in a way she could not rationalize. While Trish was still trying to understand what was happening inside her marriage, Dan had already stepped fully into a life she did not know existed. Her name was Yesenia Patino. Dan and Yesenia were not two people who met once and moved on. Their connection grew slowly and deliberately, shaped through private conversations that never happened by accident. They stayed in steady contact, talking often enough that it became part of their routine. Later, phone records would show just how frequent those conversations were, and the messages themselves told an even clearer story. There was familiarity there, emotional reliance, and an undercurrent that went beyond secrecy. It suggested they were no longer just hiding a relationship, but imagining a future that required something in Dan's life to change. As Dan's marriage grew more unstable, his connection with Yesenia grew stronger. This was no longer a relationship driven only by attraction or emotion. Over time, it took on a different shape. The conversations grew more practical, more deliberate. What began as shared feelings slowly shifted into discussions about what could come next. Frustrations were no longer just vented, they were examined. Problems were not only named, they were talked through, almost as if solutions were being weighed. That shift mattered. Because all of this was happening at the same time, Dan was talking about a family trip to Mexico. Even as plans were being discussed at home, his communication with Yesenia continued without interruption. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, it became clear that the relationship did not pause for the vacation. It ran alongside it, quietly and consistently. That detail would become impossible to ignore. When authorities reviewed the messages and call records after Trish was killed, they did not see the kind of shock or confusion you would expect from someone blindsided by tragedy. Instead, they saw steadiness, ongoing contact, a pattern that did not break. To investigators, it did not look like a relationship reacting to an unexpected loss. It looked like one moving forward exactly as planned. On February 23rd, 1991, the family arrived in Rocky Point, Mexico, and at first, nothing felt wrong. They were staying in a beachside condominium in the Las Conchas area. The children were there. Bags were unpacked. The trip looked like what it was supposed to be, a short family getaway. There were no arguments that drew attention, no obvious signs that anything was about to happen. Then came the day everything narrowed. Dan and the children left the condo to visit a nearby museum. Trish stayed behind, saying she was tired and wanted to rest. As they were leaving, Dan suddenly returned inside, telling the kids he had forgotten his passport. One of the children later said she tried to follow him in, but the door was locked. A few minutes later, he came back out and they left. When they returned a couple of hours later, the children ran inside first. That is when Trish was found. She had been brutally attacked. She was stabbed, beaten, and strangled. A knife was still lodged in her head. There was no sign that anyone had forced their way into the condo. No broken locks. No damaged doors. Nothing that supported the idea of a random intruder. What followed raised even more questions. Instead of calling for immediate emergency help, Dan drove to a Red Cross station, leaving Trish behind while time mattered. When an ambulance was finally involved, he did not ride with her to the hospital. Trish was pronounced dead later that evening. Afterward, witnesses described Dan's behavior as strangely calm. He moved the family to a motel and was seen acting almost normal, even laughing, hours after his wife had been killed. Mexican authorities initially treated the scene as a robbery, but the investigation was limited. No full autopsy was performed. Evidence handling was minimal. Back in Arizona, investigators were not satisfied. The timeline was tight. Trish had been alone. Dan had access. And the story of a random attack did not hold up. This was the moment the vacation stopped being a backdrop. It became the case. When medical examiners were finally able to look closely at what happened to Trish, one thing became clear very quickly. This was not an accident. And it was not a sudden act of chaos. This was a violent, intentional killing. The injuries told their own story. The wounds were close range, personal. They did not suggest a frantic struggle with a stranger who broke in and fled. Instead, they pointed to someone who was already there, someone with access, someone close enough to act without forcing their way inside. Nothing about the scene supported the idea of a random attacker. What made it even harder to absorb was where this happened and who was nearby. This was a family trip. Her children were just steps away, while the adults tried to explain what had happened. The reality was that this violence unfolded in the middle of what was supposed to be a shared space of safety. That detail stayed with investigators, because this was not just about how Trish died. It was about who could have done this in a place where trust already existed. This was not simply a murder discovered on vacation. It was a betrayal carried out in the presence of family. In Mexico, police responded quickly, but their focus was narrow. From the start, the scene was treated as a possible robbery, and Dan did nothing to push back against that idea. In fact, he reinforced it. He told officers that jewelry was missing and went as far as describing the stolen items in detail, even sketching what Trish's wedding ring looked like, as if helping them picture what had been taken mattered more than explaining how she had been hurt. But once the family returned to Arizona, that version of events did not hold for long. Investigators there were uneasy almost immediately. Too many details felt unfinished, too many questions unanswered. And within months, the Arizona Attorney General's office made a move that signaled just how little confidence they had in the original handling of the case. They requested that Trish's body be exhumed so a full autopsy could finally be performed, something that had never been done in Mexico. Then the case picked up a second heartbeat: Yesenia Patino. About 10 days after Trish was killed, Patino was arrested in Chandler, Arizona, for shoplifting at a local mall. It was a minor, unrelated offense, nothing that initially tied her to a homicide. But during that arrest, police searched her belongings. That is when investigators found jewelry in her possession, including a wedding ring later identified by Trish's family as Trish's. It was the same ring Dan had told Mexican police was stolen during a robbery at the condo. That discovery changed everything. That is when the investigation turned into a two-country problem. Because the murder happened in Mexico, Arizona could not simply prosecute it like a normal homicide. The path they had was conspiracy, meaning they had to prove planning and coordination connected back to Arizona. So the focus became the trail people leave behind even when they think they are being careful. Phone contacts, travel timing, money movement, the relationship Dan had been hiding, the way he spoke to Yesenia, when he spoke to her, and how the timeline looked once you lined it up next to the trip. What first looked like a tragic vacation murder began to look like something arranged in advance, with a robbery story placed on top like a cover. Two countries were involved, but the truth they kept circling was the same. By the time Dan Willoughby was arrested, investigators were no longer weighing possibilities. They were building a case around him. Arizona authorities took him into custody on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, arguing that although Trish was killed in Mexico, the planning, coordination, and intent all traced back to Arizona. It was not about where the knife was used. It was about where the decision was made. Once the case reached the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their story carefully and methodically. They showed jurors how Dan's marriage had deteriorated, how his secret relationship with Yesenia Patino deepened, and how the Mexico trip fit neatly into that timeline. They walked through the missing jewelry that later surfaced in Yesenia's possession, including Trish's wedding ring. They presented phone records and messages that showed contact continuing before the trip, during it, and after Trish was killed. Their argument was direct. This was not a crime of passion. It was not random. It was planned. It was coordinated. And it was carried out exactly as intended. The defense tried to introduce doubt. They pointed to the early confusion in Mexico, the lack of an immediate autopsy, and the challenges of proving intent across borders. They suggested coincidence and circumstance, but the evidence did not move. Messages were read aloud. Timelines were placed side by side. Dan's behavior before the trip and after Trish was found was examined in detail. Jurors were asked to look not just at what happened, but at how consistently the pieces fit together. When the verdict came back, it was unanimous. Dan Willoughby was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 25 years. A punishment that reflected the seriousness of a crime the jury believed was planned long before Mexico ever entered the picture. Dan appealed the conviction, arguing that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. But the sentence stood. An appellate review overseen by Noel Fidel upheld the ruling, closing the door on any immediate path to freedom. In the end, the courtroom stripped away the last version of Dan's story. Trish's life ended far from home, in a place she never wanted to be remembered for. Her death became a case file, a headline, and a cautionary story. But for her children, it became something much heavier. They were left to grow up with questions no child should ever have to carry, memories shaped by a trip that was supposed to feel safe. Dan Willoughby lost his freedom, the life he once lived, the roles he played as a husband and father, were replaced by a prison sentence measured in decades. Whatever story he once told himself about how this would end, the reality was far colder and permanent. Yesenia Patino became inseparable from the case itself. Her name tied forever to a crime rooted in secrecy, poor choices, and consequences that could not be undone. What began as a hidden relationship ended as a public record that followed her wherever the story was told. And this is often where true crime stories quietly end, not with justice feeling complete, but with lives permanently altered. The headlines fade, the attention moves on, but the people left behind continue living with what happened long after the world stops watching. Thank you for watching to the end. If you want more true life stories like this, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so you'll be the first to know when stories like this drop.